Now that we've covered the basics of gathering and thinking critically about information, we can think about how to present it in the most usable and persuasive manner. This involves using elements of style and clarity. This segment is subtitled, Enhance Your Communication Without Burying Your Message. Your goal, as always, is to communicate your message clearly and concisely to your readers. One way to think about your message is to remember that every big picture has little details. No, you haven't suddenly found yourself in a construction management course, but you can think of this as a metaphor for how you should think of your communications. Just as a building will not stand without a proper foundation, your ideas will not be successfully communicated without well-constructed sentences. How do we construct sentences? We use their building blocks, words. Choosing the right words is important, and it's not only because you would use them to communicate your message. Words affect how your readers respond to your message. In short, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. Most readers prefer the basic subject-verb-object sentence structure. Is this the most effective way to present information? It can be. However, there are times when we want to draw our readers' attention to some specific detail or emphasize a particular point. We can do this through our word choice, and we can also do this through our sentence structure. Let's look at word choice first. There are well over 1 million different words in the English language. This is partly because English as we speak it today has incorporated words from many other languages, and also because we tend to create new words while older words fall out of everyday usage. Many words have similar meanings, but there are subtle differences. So how do you know which words to use? You can think of them in two general ways: denotation, which refers to the dictionary meaning of the word, or connotation, which refers to the meaning or impression we associate with the word. For example, the word died and the phrase passed away are often used interchangeably, but each has a slightly different connotation and may provoke a different reaction among readers. In his landmark study of discourse analysis, Language and Power, Norman Fairclough comments on the experiential value of words, noting that, in some cases, what is ideologically significant about a text is its vocabulary items, meaning that word choice has a strong influence on reader response. You can also think of words in terms of concrete or abstract. Something that is concrete is tangible, that is, it can be perceived by the 5 senses, much like concrete the substance used for constructing buildings and roads. Abstract is intangible and refers to an idea or concept. For instance, we use the word consciousness in an abstract sense. These differences in meaning are why it is important for writers to choose their words wisely. Technical writers present complex information in audience-appropriate terms. You need to think about who your readers are and how familiar they will be with the meanings of the words you use. For example, here are 2 different publications for 2 different audiences. The New England Journal of Medicine is written for healthcare professionals. The technical writer can safely assume the readers are familiar with the terminology. In contrast, WebMD is written for a more general audience, so the writer needs to explain medical terms and concepts in different ways. Now let's look at sentence structure. When is a long sentence too long? Some writers are criticized for writing short, choppy sentences, while others are criticized for writing overly long, complicated sentences. What is the right length? If you need a general guideline, then here it is. Sentences should be between 12 and 25 words. This doesn't mean that every single sentence you write needs to fall within these limits, but it is something to keep in mind when revising and editing. Look at these 2 sentences, for example. The first one, the river is 63 miles long and it averages 50 yards in width and its depth averages 8 feet. The first one is monotonous. No matter what your sentence length turns out to be, avoid using the word and more than once per sentence. Now let's look at the second one. The river, which is 63 miles long, is an average of 50 yards wide and 8 feet deep. It is much easier to read and follow than the first one. You can also use subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns to combine shorter sentences together. I've shown you some examples here, but of course there are others. You can vary sentence length by using longer sentences for providing details and supporting evidence, while using shorter sentences for emphatic statements. Shorter sentences are good for points you want the reader to keep in mind. For example, a black hole is a collapsed neutron star with theoretically infinite mass and an intense gravitational field. Even light cannot escape. So in this example, the longer sentence tells the reader what a black hole is, while the shorter sentence emphasizes the main point. Bullet lists and tables are very useful ways of presenting information concisely. This is especially true when you are describing effects or process. Compare the two boxes. In the first one, the sentence is difficult to read because it doesn't use parallel structure, and the writer uses the word "and" more than once in a sentence, making it seem monotonous. But the revised version presents the same information as a bullet list. Sleep deprivation impairs academic performance, increases risks of upper respiratory tract infections, and has a negative impact on personal and social activities. Notice too that each bullet point begins with a verb, and the parallel structure makes it easier to read and remember each point. Avoid pompous language. What do I mean by pompous? Unfortunately, beginning writers tend to believe that stating concepts simply is incorrect because they don't sound as intelligent or educated as they think they should. This belief leads to pompous language, which is also called affectation. Affectation has a negative impact on your readers. They have to work harder to get your point, which alienates them. Examples include phrases such as "pursuant to" instead of "about," or "in view of the fact that" instead of "because." I've listed a few more examples here. Things like "it is worthy of note that," "it must be remembered that," etc. Leave out phrases like these because they do nothing to convey your meaning. For example, using a phrase like "it has come to my attention that" is extraneous. Simply state whatever it is that has come to your attention. As shown here, pompous language does not make you seem more intelligent or educated. In fact, it can do just the opposite. Now here is an example of affectation from the humanities. Technical writers are just as guilty, but I chose this extreme example to show you just how difficult pompous language is to read. By recognizing that if a contemporary understanding of Picasso's pasted papers is to avoid reading back the ambivalences of the present toward the modernist project into visual texts that were produced at a moment when the project was viewed quite differently, attention should be paid to the conjecture of late 1912, early 1913, of which that project and those texts were a part. Well, if you're wondering what this writer was going on about and why anyone would publish writing like that, you're not alone. It's hard enough for a native English speaker to make sense of it. Imagine trying to make sense of it if English were not your first language. This writer is trying to appear intellectual, but his affected writing is merely unintelligible. If no one can understand your point, you're not communicating. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's from a humanities book. They expect that sort of writing, don't they? Well, maybe they do, but that doesn't mean they enjoy reading it. And if you're thinking that this sort of writing never happens outside the ivory tower, consider this. How many road accidents do you suppose were caused by drivers trying to drive and make sense of this sign? Whatever your topic or major field is, please be considerate of your readers. And there are ways to make even complex ideas more concise. Look at these draft and revised examples. Particularly the second one. And here is another example of how eliminating unnecessary words makes writing easier to read. The first sentence is written in the passive voice. When it is revised to the active voice, it's easier to read. You may also notice that some words were eliminated from the revised sentence. As I stated earlier, you should, generally speaking, avoid the passive voice. You can express your ideas more clearly and use fewer words by writing in the active voice, and the examples here show you how it's done. Can any concept be explained simply? Yes, if the technical communicator takes the words of Albert Einstein to heart. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Some great examples of how complex topics can be explained simply are found on the 3-Minute Thesis website. Now, a title such as Hypoxia-Activated Prodrugs, a novel approach for breast cancer treatment, sounds very complicated. Yet it is explained clearly in about 3 minutes. I have included that presentation at the end of this segment so you can see for yourself. But before we get to that, here are a few takeaway points to keep in mind. Do not use long words if shorter, simpler words will convey the same meaning. Eliminate words and phrases that add no meaning to a sentence. Vary your sentence length and structure to emphasize your points. Avoid redundant phrases. Be concise. And avoid the passive voice.
Up next from the University of Toronto is Jasdeep Sagar. She's doing a PhD in medical biophysics, supervised by Professor Ian Tannock. Her presentation title is Hypoxia-Activated Prodrugs, a novel approach for breast cancer treatment.
So very good afternoon to you all. My name is Jazz, and the focus of my PhD is on chemotherapy and hypoxia-activated prodrugs in the tumor microenvironment. As you're all well aware of, unfortunately, breast cancer is still a major cause of death and disability in women. Chemotherapy is frequently given, but what can occur over time is that the tumor can develop a resistance and treatment will fail. But in order to better understand this process, we really need to understand the role of the tumor microenvironment. So if you'll join me in imagining that a solid tumor is quite similar to a ball that's packed with many abnormally dividing cells, nourished with blood vessels. And if we were to zoom in on just one blood vessel and some of the surrounding cells, we would come up with something similar to what I've depicted here on screen. So in red, we have that blood vessel, and immediately beside it is a group of cells that are richly nourished with blood, which is basically a combination of oxygen and nutrients. Because of this, the cells closest to that blood vessel are extremely well fed, so they're growing quite quickly or proliferating. But if you move farther away from that blood vessel, you enter regions where cells have a reduced nutrient content. They have a low pH, which means they're living in an acidic environment because the blood's not getting here. And on top of all that, those cells out there are barely breathing because they don't get enough oxygen, and that's what's known as hypoxia. Due to all of these factors out here, the cells farther away are barely dividing or growing. Chemotherapy enters that blood vessel, and it's very good at actively targeting and killing rapidly dividing cells. So those cells closest to the blood vessel, they get wiped out. Unfortunately, cells that are farther away survive chemotherapy treatment because they don't receive enough drug. Chemotherapy is typically delivered in a 3-week cycle, and that's to allow for a patient's normal body tissues to recover. So for example, the bone marrow, hair follicles. It's in between those periods of rest of chemotherapy that the cells that were formerly farther away now have an increased access to both oxygen and nutrients. Remember, because those other guys got wiped out. And that stimulates these guys to start dividing. And they therefore regrow or repopulate the tumor, leading to chemotherapy treatment failure. So the focus of my work then is working on how to combat this problem of chemotherapy treatment failure using hypoxia-activated prodrugs. And these are called prodrugs because they're administered to the tumor through that very same blood vessel in an inactive form. And they are only activated in the hypoxic area. And when they're activated, they kill that tumor tissue. So what I found is that when you combine chemotherapy with hypoxia-activated prodrugs, you increase tumor cell death, and that leads to maximum treatment efficacy and therapeutic outcome. Thank you very much.